The arena was frozen in time, thousands of beings holding their breath as Una stood over Korthax with her sword raised for the killing blow. Blood dripped from both of them onto the floor, mixing together in pools that reflected the harsh lights overhead. Korthax looked up at her with fear in his amber eyes, and his mandibles moved in patterns that her translator recognized as the Vethrani plea for quick death. He expected her to kill him because that was what his people did when they won. That was what any proper predator would do to defeated prey. Una held the blade steady for a long moment, letting the weight of the silence press down on everyone watching. Then she spoke. "You took my hand to prove I was weak," she said, and her voice carried through the arena's perfect acoustics to reach every ear and translator. "And you were wrong." She lowered her sword slightly, and confusion flickered across Korthax's face. "Now I am going to prove something else." Her blade came down in a precise arc that every observer would replay and analyze for years to come. And it passed through the exact same point on Korthax's lower left wrist that his molecular blade had severed from her own arm 3 weeks ago. His hand fell to the ground with a wet sound that echoed in silence, and Korthax screamed in a voice that had never known such pain. "Mercy would be killing you," Una said as she stepped back and watched him clutch the stump of his wrist. "But this is not mercy." She raised her voice so that every camera and microphone would capture her words. "This is making sure you remember every single day for the rest of your life what happens when you mistake kindness for weakness." The Vethrani section erupted in chaos as delegates screamed accusations of cruelty and demanded retribution. But the officials who monitored the duel were already reviewing the laws. What Una had done was perfectly legal. She had won the challenge duel and claimed the traditional right of the victor to determine the fate of the defeated, and by Vethrani law she could have taken his life. Instead, she had taken his hand, and there was nothing in any legal code that prohibited such a choice. Korthax was carried from the arena by medical personnel, while Una stood alone in the center of the floor with her sword still in her hand. She was bleeding from 6 wounds, and her legs were beginning to shake from exhaustion. But she did not sit down. She had one more thing to do. "I want to say something," she announced, and the translators carried her words to every species present. To everyone who was watching this today, the crowd fell silent again, and she felt the weight of 1 billion eyes across the galaxy, focusing on her small and wounded figure. "Humans are kind," she said, "and we show mercy, and we try to solve problems with words before violence, because we believe that is the right way to live." She raised her prosthetic hand with its purple blessing cord and her steel sword with its simple blade. "But do not ever make the mistake of thinking that kindness means we cannot fight, or that mercy means we are afraid to hurt those who hurt others." She looked directly at the Vethrani section, where delegates were still arguing among themselves. "We choose to be gentle because we have seen what we are capable of when we are not, and we do not like what that looks like." Her gaze swept across the arena to the sections where smaller and more peaceful species were watching with expressions that ranged from wonder to something that might have been hope. "If you threaten those who cannot protect themselves, then you will answer to us, and you will find that humans can be just as unforgiving as any predator in this galaxy." The Mallory section exploded in cheers that sounded like singing, and Terrace was on their feet with tears streaming down their face. Other species joined them, beings from worlds that had long lived in fear of Vethrani aggression and others like it. And the sound built until the arena walls seemed to shake with it. Una finally let herself lower her sword, and the strength went out of her legs. She sat down on the bloody floor and let the medical team rush to her side. And for the first time since Korthax had taken her hand, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of what she had been through. The next Few days passed in a blur of medical treatment and official inquiries and interviews. That she refused to give the wound on her ribs required surgery, and the cuts on her arms and legs left scars that would never fully fade. But she was alive, and she had won. The aftermath of the duel spread across the galaxy in waves that changed everything they touched. The Mallory formally requested human diplomatic protection for their homeworld, and within a week 17 other species had made similar requests. The Vethrani Dominion recalled their delegation from Convergence. Poinan entered a period of internal turmoil as younger members of their society questioned traditions that an ancient culture had never examined before. Korthax himself disappeared from public view, and reports later confirmed that he had been stripped of his titles and exiled from the Dominion for bringing shame upon their people. Yuna returned to her duties as military attaché with a new prosthetic that was far more advanced than her original, a gift from the Sindari, who had been impressed by her performance and wanted to show their respect. 3 months after the duel, she was walking through the main concourse of Convergence. When she heard a small voice call her name, she turned to find Terrace standing with a group of young Mallory who were visiting the station for the first time, and the children were staring at her with expressions of awe that made her uncomfortable. "Is that her?" one of the children asked in a whisper that the translator faithfully rendered. "Yes," Terrace said with a smile. "That is Commander Yuna Park, the one who fought the monster." Another child said. Yuna knelt down so that she was at eye level with the children, and she showed them her prosthetic hand with its advanced fingers that moved almost like real ones. "He was not a monster," she told them gently. "He was just someone who had never been taught that there was another way to be strong." "Did it hurt?" the smallest child asked, pointing at her hand. "Yes," Yuna admitted. "It hurt very much. But sometimes we have to go through pain to become who we are meant to be." The children did not fully understand her words, but they nodded solemnly as if they did. Terrace walked with her after the children had been led away by their teachers, and they traveled in comfortable silence until they reached the observation window where Yuna had stood so many times before. "You changed everything," Terrace said quietly. "I did what needed to be done." Yuna replied, "The Vethrani are not the only ones who have changed their view of humans since that day. And there are species across the galaxy who now look to Earth as protectors rather than prey." Yuna watched a ship from a distant world dock at the station, and she thought about all the beings inside it who might need someone to stand between them and those who would do them harm. "That is a heavy responsibility," she said. "Yes," Terrace agreed. "But I think your species has the shoulders for it." A young journalist from a human news network found her later that day and asked for a comment about her new status as a symbol of human strength. Yuna thought for a moment before she answered. "I am not a symbol," she said. "I am just a person who refused to let a bully win." "But what would you say to other humans who want to know what your victory means for our place in the galaxy?" The journalist pressed. Yuna looked at her prosthetic hand and flexed the fingers that would never feel the wind or the warmth of another person's touch. And she thought about everything she had lost and everything she had gained. "I would say that we should never be afraid to be kind," she said, "because true strength is not about being willing to fight, but about being willing to protect those who cannot protect themselves." She smiled at the journalist and added one final thought, "And I would say that anyone who mistakes our kindness for weakness will learn the truth the hard way." The journalist thanked her and left, and Yuna returned to her window to watch the stars somewhere out there in the vast darkness of space. Species were learning that humanity was not what they had assumed. They were learning that the soft-voiced diplomats and the smiling traders and the helpful scientists were just one face of a species that had clawed its way up from the mud of a death world through sheer stubborn refusal to give up. They were learning that humans could be the best friends the galaxy had ever known, or the worst enemies it had ever faced, and they were learning, slowly but surely, that the choice of which face they saw was entirely up to them. Una flexed her prosthetic hand one more time and then turned away from the window to get back to work. There were always more bullies out there, and someone had to stand between them and everyone else. That was what she had always done. And that was what she would always do, because that was what it meant to be human. Korthax attacked before the echo of the signal chime had faded. His forearms moved in a blur of violence, molecular blades cutting through the air where Una's head had been a heartbeat earlier. She was already moving, sliding to the left in a low stance that her grandmother had called the river stone. And the tip of her sword traced a line across his lower right arm as she passed first blood to her. Though the cut was shallow and meant nothing against a Vethrani's thick hide, the crowd gasped because no one had expected her to last even that long. And Korthax snarled with something that might have been surprise. "Lucky," he said as he turned to face her. "It will not happen again." His next attack was faster and more controlled. A coordinated assault from all four arms that should have been impossible to avoid. Una did not try to avoid it. She stepped into the attack instead, moving past his guard in the space between heartbeats. And her blade scored another line across his torso before she danced away. Blood the color of old copper beaded along the cut. And Korthax looked down at himself with genuine confusion. "How?" he demanded. Una did not answer. She was already flowing into her next movement, a technique she had developed in the long hours of solitary practice that used the weight of her prosthetic arm to counterbalance the momentum of her blade. Korthax swung at her with both right arms together, a crushing blow that would have broken her in half if it had connected. But she was not there anymore. She had pivoted around the attack like water flowing around a stone, and her sword opened a third wound across his back. The Vethrani roared with frustration and spun to face her. And for the first time since the duel began, there was something other than confidence in his amber eyes. In the stands, a group of Sindari mathematicians were watching with growing interest, their analytical minds breaking down each exchange into component variables. "Her missing hand," one of them said to another. "She's using it against him." "Explain," the second Sindari demanded. "All of his training assumes opponents with bilateral symmetry, and every strike he's learned is calibrated for targets that move in predictable patterns based on having two matching arms." The first Sindari gestured at the arena where Una was flowing around another devastating attack. "Her body geometry is wrong for his programming, and she has turned her injury into an advantage that his instincts cannot account for." Down on the arena floor, Korthax was beginning to understand the same thing. Every attack that should have connected passed through empty air, and every opening he created was somehow already closed by the time he tried to exploit it. The human moved like nothing he had ever fought before, like smoke and shadow and something that refused to obey the rules of combat he had mastered over decades. "Stand still and fight," he bellowed. "Why?" Una asked. And her voice was calm, despite the exertion that was beginning to show in her breathing. "So you can kill me the way you planned." She struck again, a quick slash that opened a cut across his upper left shoulder. And Korthax felt something he had not experienced since he was a child learning to hunt. He felt fear. The human should have been dead by now. But instead she was cutting him apart piece by piece with a simple steel blade that had no right to penetrate his ceremonial armor. He had studied humans before this fight, and everything he had learned told him they were soft and weak and driven by emotions. That made them easy to manipulate. But this human was not soft. This human was something else entirely. Una saw the moment when his confidence cracked, and she pressed her advantage. Her blade became a silver blur as she launched an assault of her own, striking from angles that Korthax had never seen and retreating before he could bring his superior reach to bear. She was not trying to kill him yet because she needed him to understand first. She needed him to feel what Terrace had felt when he loomed over them with threats and violence. She needed him to know what it was like to face an opponent who simply would not stop. Korthax abandoned his ceremonial style and began fighting with pure predator instinct, his forearms lashing out in patterns that had no strategy beyond overwhelming force. One of his blades caught Yuna across the ribs, opening a wound that immediately began to weep red through her combat suit. She did not slow down. Another strike grazed her leg, and the third scored a line across her shoulder. But she kept moving and kept fighting and kept cutting him with wounds that were beginning to add up. "Why will you not fall?" Korthax screamed. "Because I'm human," Yuna said. "And we do not know how to quit." The crowd was silent now, watching something that none of them had expected to see. The mighty Vethrani warrior was bleeding from a dozen wounds, and the one-handed human woman was still standing in the Mallory section of the stands. Terrace was gripping the railing with both hands and whispering prayers in their native tongue. In the human section, Marines who had served with Yuna were watching with tears streaming down their faces and pride swelling in their chests. In the Vethrani section, delegates who had come to watch their champion humiliate a prey species were shifting uncomfortably and refusing to meet each other's eyes. Korthax made his final mistake when his frustration overcame his training. He charged at Yuna with all four arms spread wide, intending to simply grab her and crush her in his grip, like the small, fragile thing she appeared to be. Yuna planted her feet and raised her sword in both hands, flesh and metal working together as she had trained them to do. She waited until he was committed to the charge and could not change direction. And then she moved. The technique was called the Mountain's Answer, and her grandmother had taught it to her on the last summer before the old woman died. It was a counter designed for opponents who were larger and stronger and certain of their victory, and it required absolute precision and perfect timing and complete faith that the blade would find its mark. Yuna had all three. She pivoted at the last possible instant and let Korthax's momentum carry him past her. And as he passed, she drove her sword through the gap in his ceremonial armor, where the chest plate met the shoulder guard. The blade sank deep into flesh and muscle, and she felt it scrape against bone before she twisted and pulled it free. Korthax stumbled and fell to one knee, and when he tried to rise, his body would not obey him. The wound was not fatal, but something important had been severed inside him, and his lower right arm hung limp and useless at his side. Yuna stood over him with her sword pointed at his throat and blood dripping from her own wounds. Onto the arena floor, the crowd held its breath. Korthax looked up at her with eyes that showed something no Vethrani had ever shown to a human before. He was afraid. "Yield." Yuna said, "Never." Korthax snarled, but his voice cracked on the word. "Then this ends now," she replied. She raised her sword for the killing blow, and the arena erupted in chaos as Vethrani delegates screamed for her to show mercy and human observers shouted for her to finish it, and 1,000 other voices cried out in languages she did not understand. Yuna heard none of them. She looked down at Korthax, and she saw the creature who had taken her hand and laughed about it. She saw the predator who had threatened Terrace and 100 others like them. She saw everything that was wrong with a galaxy that believed kindness was weakness and mercy was defeat, and she made her choice. The final days before the duel passed like water through a broken dam. Too fast to hold and impossible to stop, Convergence Point had become the center of galactic attention, and ships arrived from every corner of known space carrying observers and journalists and gamblers who wanted to witness what they all assumed would be a quick and brutal execution. Yuna ignored Them all she trained in the early hours when the corridors were empty. And she studied recordings of Vethrani combat techniques until she could predict their movements in her sleep. And she spoke to no one except Terrace, who brought her meals that she barely remembered to eat. Korthax did the opposite. He trained in the public gymnasium where cameras could capture his every move. And he demonstrated techniques on practice dummies while narrating for his audience how he would use each one to take Yuna apart piece by piece. His forearms moved in patterns that seemed impossible to follow. And he wielded weapons in combinations that no two-armed species could hope to match. The human will learn, he announced to a crowd of admirers on the 5th day, that there is a natural order to the galaxy, and prey does not challenge predator without consequences. The betting odds updated constantly on screens throughout the station, and Yuna's chances dropped lower with each passing hour. By the 6th day, the computers calculated her probability of survival at 0.3%, and several human officials made quiet arrangements to transport her body home after the fight on the evening before the duel. Yuna sat alone in her quarters with her sword across her knees and her eyes closed. She was not meditating exactly, but rather letting her mind wander through the landscape of her memories. She saw her grandmother in the garden behind her house, moving through sword forms with the easy grace of someone who had practiced. For 60 years, she saw her mother working double shifts at the factory while her father's hospital bills piled up on the fuzzy kitchen table. She saw her younger brother Junho on the day she left for the military academy, trying not to cry as he hugged her goodbye. She saw the recruitment officer who had looked at her test scores and told her she could go anywhere she wanted in the service. And she saw herself choosing the diplomatic course because she wanted to prevent wars rather than fight them. She saw every step of the path that had led her to this moment. And she understood that she had been preparing for this fight her entire life. A knock at her door pulled her from her thoughts, and she opened it to find Terrace standing in the corridor with a small package in their furry hands. "I wanted to give you something," the Mallory said. "For tomorrow." Yuna accepted the package and unwrapped it carefully to reveal a strip of woven fabric in the deep purple that was sacred to Terrace's people. "It is a blessing cord," Terrace explained. "We give them to those we care about when they face great danger. And the weave contains prayers for strength and courage and safe return." Yuna felt her throat tighten, and she had to take a breath before she could speak. "Thank you," she said. "I will wear it," Terrace nodded and then surprised her by stepping forward and wrapping their small arms around her waist in a hug that lasted only a moment but carried the weight of everything they could not say. "Please do not die," the Mallory whispered. "I will do my best." Yuna replied. After Terrace left, she tied the blessing cord around her prosthetic wrist where it would be visible during the fight. And she allowed herself a small smile at the thought of what Korthax would make of such a sentimental gesture. Her door chimed again an hour later, and this time she opened it to find a group of human Marines in formal dress uniforms standing at attention in the corridor. "Commander Park," the sergeant at the front said. "We came to offer our assistance." "I appreciate that," Yuna replied. "But this is something I have to do alone." "We know," the sergeant said. "But we wanted you to know that we found some irregularities in the original duel documentation. And if you want, we can file an appeal that would delay the fight indefinitely." Yuna shook her head. "If we use tricks and legal maneuvers to avoid this," she said, "then we prove everything Korthax says about us. And every human who comes after me will have to deal with the reputation of a species that runs from challenges." The sergeant was quiet for a moment, and then he nodded slowly. "We understand," he said. "And for what it is worth, Commander, we think you are the bravest person we have ever served with." The Marines saluted as one, and Yuna returned the gesture, even though her chest ached with an emotion she could not name. After they left, she sat down at her personal terminal and recorded a message for her family. She told her mother that she was proud to be her daughter and that the strength she carried came from watching her mother work and sacrifice and never give up. She told her brother that he had grown into a better person than she could ever be and that she expected him to take care of their mother when she was gone. She did not tell them that she expected to die, but she knew they would understand what this message meant if they ever received it. When the recording was finished, she saved it to be sent in the event of her death. And then she picked up her sword and began her final practice session. The movements flowed through her like water now, and her body had finally accepted its new shape with its missing piece and its changed balance. She was not the same warrior she had been a month ago, but she was not less than what she had been either. She was something new, forged in pain and tempered by determination. And tomorrow the galaxy would see what that meant. The night passed slowly, and Yuna did not sleep. She sat by her window and watched the stars turn in their eternal dance. And she thought about all the species out there who believed that humans were weak because they showed mercy, and soft because they tried to solve problems with words before violence. They were wrong. Humans were kind because they chose to be, not because they had to be. And there was a vast difference between refusing to fight and being unable to fight. Tomorrow she would teach Korthax that lesson. Tomorrow she would show the galaxy what happened when you pushed a human too far. Dawn came as it always did, marked on the station by a gradual brightening of the lights that mimicked the sunrise. And Yuna rose from her chair and dressed. In simple combat clothes, she strapped her sword to her back and tied her hair away from her face and checked her prosthetic hand one final time. The blessing cord from Terrace gleamed purple against the dull metal, and she touched it gently before leaving her quarters. The corridors were lined with beings from 100 different worlds, all of them watching in silence as she walked toward the arena. Some looked at her with pity, and some with confusion, and some with something that might have been admiration. She met none of their eyes. The arena doors loomed before her, massive slabs of metal inscribed with symbols from every major species that had ever used this place to settle disputes. She pushed them open and stepped inside. Thousands of observers filled the seats that rose in tiers around the central floor, and their voices fell silent as she entered. Cameras from every corner of the galaxy focused on her small figure as she walked to her position and stood waiting. The opposite doors opened, and Korthax strode through with all the confidence of a predator who had never known defeat. He was armed with ceremonial weapons across all four of his arms, molecular blades that gleamed with deadly promise and tools designed to cause maximum pain before death. He looked at Yuna and laughed. "You came," he said. "I thought perhaps you would run in the night like the prey animal you are." Yuna drew her sword and held it in a single-handed grip that felt as natural as breathing. "I am exactly where I want to be," she said. The signal chime sounded, and the duel began. 3 weeks passed on Convergence Point, and the galaxy watched to see what humanity would do. The official response from Earth was measured and diplomatic, with strongly worded protests filed through proper channels and demands for investigation submitted to the appropriate committees. Korthax walked freely through the station and laughed at every camera that captured his image. And he told anyone who would listen that the human female had gotten exactly what prey deserved when it forgot its place. The Vethrani delegation claimed that the duel had been conducted within acceptable parameters, and they pointed to obscure provisions in their ancient laws that permitted escalation when a challenger showed insufficient respect. The legal experts argued back and forth while Korthax collected admirers and gave interviews about how easily humans broke. Yuna heard all of this from her hospital bed where the doctors had finally admitted what she already knew: the molecular blade had destroyed her cells at a level that no regeneration technology could repair, and her left hand was gone forever. They fitted her with a basic prosthetic on the 14th day, a simple mechanical device that could grip and release, but nothing more. And she spent an hour learning to use it before she thanked the doctors and returned to her quarters. She did not return to her duties. The human ambassador offered her a medical discharge and a trip home on the next transport ship. And he told her that no one would think less of her for leaving after what she had suffered. Yuna thanked him and declined. Her quarters were small but private, and she had cleared the furniture to create an open space in the center of the room. She stood there now with her feet bare on the cold floor and her arms at her sides, and she breathed. Her grandmother had taught her the sword when she was 7 years old, back in a small town outside of Bizan, where the old woman had lived alone since her husband died. Every summer, Yuna had traveled there to spend 2 months learning forms and footwork and the philosophy that her grandmother believed was more important than any technique. The sword is not a weapon, her grandmother used to say. The sword is a question, and every fight is your answer. Yuna had not held a blade in 15 years because life had taken her in other directions. But she remembered. She remembered everything. Her body moved through the first form slowly and awkwardly because her balance was wrong without her left hand. And muscles that had once known this dance protested at being woken from such a long sleep. She fell twice and cursed once, and then she began again. On the second day, she sent a message to Earth requesting a specific item from a specific craftsman, and she was told it would arrive in 12 days. On the third day, she began training for real. 18 hours she worked each day, with breaks only for food and water, and the minimum sleep her body demanded. And she rebuilt herself from the ground up. The prosthetic hand could not grip a sword, but she learned to use its weight as a counterbalance. Her missing fingers could not feel an opponent's movement through the blade, but she trained her remaining senses until she could read the air itself. Every form she had learned assumed 2 hands on the hilt, so she created new forms that used only one. Her body screamed at her to stop, and her mind whispered that this was pointless, and her heart ached with a grief she refused to acknowledge. But she did not stop. Terrace came to visit on the 8th day and found her in the middle of a training sequence with sweat dripping down her face and her prosthetic arm moving in patterns that looked almost natural. "Commander Park," the little Mallory said with their translator converting their musical voice into flat English. "I came to apologize." Yuna finished her form and stood still with her chest heaving. "You have nothing to apologize for," she said. "You lost your hand protecting me," Terrace replied, and their large eyes were wet with tears that threatened to fall. "I should have signed the agreement, and none of this would have happened." Yuna knelt down so that she was at eye level with the small alien, and she reached out with her flesh and blood hand to touch their shoulder gently. "If you had signed that agreement," she said, "your people would have lost everything they built over 300 years. And Korthax would have moved on to the next victim feeling even more powerful than before. But your hand," Terrace whispered, "is gone." Yuna agreed. "And I miss it every moment of every day, but I do not regret what I did." Terrace was silent for a long moment, and then they asked the question that Yuna had been waiting for. "Why are you training so hard if the duel is over?" Yuna stood and walked to the small desk in the corner where her personal terminal displayed a document written in the harsh angular script of the Vethrani language. "I have been reading their laws," she said, "and I found something interesting hidden in a section that deals with permanent maiming during honor duels." Terrace moved closer to look at the screen, even though they could not read the alien text. "When a challenger is permanently maimed during a duel that was supposed to end at first blood," Yuna continued, "the main party has the right to demand a reopening of the challenge within 1 solar cycle of the original fight." The Mallory's eyes went wide. "You are going to fight him again," they said. "I'm going to finish this." Yuna replied, "But he is a trained warrior who has killed dozens of opponents in ritual combat. And you are injured and alone." Yuna smiled. And there was something in that smile that made Terrace take a step backward. "He thinks he broke me," she said. And that is going to be his last mistake. Her sword arrived on the 20th day, and she opened the case with hands that did not tremble even though her heart was pounding. It was a simple weapon by galactic standards, with no energy field and no molecular edge and no computerized balance system. It was just steel and leather and wood, folded and shaped and polished by a craftsman whose family had been making blades for 400 years. Yuna lifted it from the case, and the weight settled into her palm like a homecoming. And she knew in that moment that her grandmother was with her. She filed the formal challenge on the 21st day. The news spread across Convergence Point within hours and across the galaxy within days. And the reaction was everything she had expected. The Vethrani thought it was hilarious that the crippled human wanted to die properly this time. And Korthax accepted the challenge with a public statement that he would mount her skull on his wall as a trophy. The other species were horrified or fascinated or both. And betting pools opened on 100 different worlds, with odds that gave Yuna a fraction of a % chance of survival. The human ambassador called her into his office and begged her to reconsider. And he told her that Earth could not afford to lose a capable officer to pointless pride. "This is not about pride." Yuna told him. "Then what is it about?" He demanded. She thought about Terrace trembling in front of Korthax. And she thought about all the other small and peaceful species who would be watching this fight. And she thought about what it meant to be human in a galaxy full of predators. "It is about showing them what we are made of," she said. The ambassador had no response to that. And he signed the paperwork that would allow the challenge to proceed. Yuna returned to her quarters and picked up her sword and began to practice. She had 7 days left, and she intended to use every moment somewhere on the other side of the station. Korthax was celebrating his upcoming victory with feasts and admirers and grand speeches about Vethrani superiority. He had no idea what was coming. Humans had a saying about wounded animals, but Yuna preferred a different one that her grandmother had taught her all those years ago. The sword that has been broken and reforged is stronger than the sword that has never known the fire. She had been broken, and now she was being reforged. And soon Korthax would learn exactly how strong that made her. The diplomatic station known as Convergence Point floated in neutral space like a jewel among the stars. And Commander Yuna Park had called it home for the past 3 years. She stood at the observation window of the human embassy wing and watched ships from dozens of worlds arrive and depart, each one carrying diplomats and traders. He was uncaring, and soldiers who had come to negotiate the endless business of galactic civilization. Yuna was 34 years old, with short black hair and steady, dark eyes that had seen more than their share of conflict. And she served as Earth's military, attached to this place where species that had traveled the stars for millennia gathered to talk instead of fight. Her job was simple in theory but complex in practice, and it required her to stand between humanity and any threat that might emerge from the tangled web of alien politics. Today, that threat had a name. The Vethrani Dominion had sent a delegation to renegotiate trade routes through a sector that bordered human space. And their chief diplomat was a four-armed predator named Korthax, who stood nearly 8 feet tall and wore his ceremonial scars like medals. The Vethrani were hunters by nature and conquerors by choice, and they had built their civilization on the belief that mercy was the greatest weakness a species could possess. Yuna had dealt with their kind before and knew how to read the subtle shifts in their posture that telegraphed aggression. So when she entered the main negotiation hall, and saw Korthax looming over a trembling Mallory representative. She moved without hesitation. The Mallory were small beings with soft fur and large eyes, who had never developed weapons or warfare. And they survived in the galactic community through trade and diplomacy and the protection of larger powers. This particular Mallory was named Terrace, and Yuna had shared tea with them on several occasions and found them to be kind and thoughtful and utterly unprepared for someone like Korthax. "You will sign the agreement," Korthax was saying in a voice like grinding stone, "or I will show your people what happens to those who waste the time of the Dominion." Terrace was shaking so badly that the translator device around their neck rattled against their chest. And the other diplomats in the hall were carefully looking anywhere, except at the confrontation. Yuna stepped between them. "Delegate Korthax," she said in a calm and measured tone, "the Mallory have the right to review any agreement for 30 standard days before signing, and threatening them violates 17 different provisions of the Convergence Accords." Korthax looked down at her with all 4 of his amber eyes, and his mandibles clicked in what she recognized as contempt. "A human," he said, "and a female at that, speaking to me about rights and provisions while a warrior conducts business. This is not a battlefield," Yuna replied, "and business conducted under threat of violence is not business at all." The hall had gone silent, and Yuna could feel the weight of dozens of alien gazes pressing against her back. She knew what she was doing was dangerous because the Vethrani did not forget insults. But she also knew that if she stepped aside now, then Terrace would sign whatever Korthax demanded, and the Mallory would lose everything. "You dare," Korthax breathed, and his 4 arms spread wide in the traditional Vethrani display of challenge. "You dare to correct me in front of lesser species, as if you were my equal." "I dare," Yuna said simply. The silence stretched for a long moment, and then Korthax made a sound that might have been laughter if laughter could cut. "Then I invoke the right of satisfaction," he declared, "by the ancient laws that even this station recognizes. I challenge you to a duel of honor for the insult you have given me." Yuna heard Terrace gasp behind her, and she felt her own heart rate increase even as she kept her expression neutral. The challenge duel was annulled. Vethrani custom that the galactic community had agreed to, recognized centuries ago as a way of preventing larger conflicts, and refusing one was considered an admission of wrongdoing under their laws. If she refused, then she would be saying that Korthax was right and that she had no place correcting him, and the Mallory would have no protection at all. "I accept," she said. Korthax's mandibles spread in what she now recognized as a genuine smile, and something cold settled in her stomach. The duel was held 3 hours later in the ceremonial chamber that Convergence Point maintained for exactly such purposes, and representatives from every major species had gathered to witness what they expected to be a brief and bloody spectacle. Yuna stood on one side of the circular arena wearing the light combat suit the regulations required, and she held a standard issue shock baton that was designed to incapacitate rather than kill. The rules of a satisfaction duel were clear, and the fight would end at first blood with honor satisfied for both parties. Korthax stood on the other side with his 4 arms empty because Vethrani tradition held that a true warrior needed no weapons against prey, and he watched her with the patient hunger of a predator who already knew the outcome. The signal came as a single chime that echoed through the chamber, and Korthax moved. He was faster than anything his size had a right to be, and Yuna barely managed to dodge his first strike as his lower right arm swept through the space where her head had been. She countered with her baton and felt it connect with his side. But the shock that should have dropped a human barely made him twitch. His upper left arm caught her across the shoulder and sent her stumbling, and she realized with sudden clarity that he had been toying with her first blood, Korthax announced. And Yuna saw that his claws had opened a shallow cut on her arm that was already beginning to drip red onto the floor. She started to lower her baton in acknowledgement of the duel's end. But Korthax did not stop. His lower left arm came up holding something that gleamed with an oily rainbow sheen, and she recognized it as a molecular blade just as it passed through her left wrist. There was no pain at first, because the cut was too clean and too fast. And Yuna watched her own hand fall to the floor as if it belonged to someone else. The crowd erupted in shouts and screams in the translator. Systems struggled to keep up with the chaos. But Yuna heard none of it. She looked at the stump of her wrist where blood was beginning to pulse in bright arterial spurts. And she looked at her hand lying on the ground with its fingers still curled around nothing. And she looked at Korthax, who was laughing with all four of his arms raised in triumph. The pain came then like fire and ice together. And she felt her knees begin to buckle, but she did not fall. She locked her legs and she pressed her right hand against the stump of her left wrist, and she stared at Korthax with eyes that held no tears and no fear and no surrender. "You should not have done that," she said. Korthax stopped laughing, and for just a moment something flickered in his amber eyes that might have been uncertainty. Then the medical team reached her, and the world went white at the edges. And the last thing Yuna saw before they carried her away was Terrace standing at the edge of the arena with tears streaming down their furred face. She wanted to tell them that it would be all right, that this was not the end, that she had survived worse than this, but the words would not come. And the darkness took her. When she woke in the medical bay with machines humming around her, and the place where her hand used to be wrapped in regeneration, bandages that she already knew would not work. Yuna made herself a promise. She would not cry, and she would not beg, and she would not run. She would find a way to make Korthax understand exactly what he had done. And she would teach the entire galaxy that humans did not break so easily. The nurse offered her sedation, and she refused. She had plans to make.